Hello and welcome to American Catholic History. If you like our podcast, be sure to rate us and give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crowe.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today we're talking about Margaret Brent, the woman who saved Maryland.
Yeah, but considering how Marylanders drive, is that really a good thing?
Hey now, let's not start off by insulting a good number of our listeners.
Yeah, you're right. I kid. I spent 3 years living in Maryland when I was a seminarian at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg. I have very fond memories of northern Maryland, its mountains and its vistas.
And we have a pilgrimage itinerary that goes down into southern Maryland to a lot of the sites where the action of today's episodes happen.
Right. Maryland has so much history, and it is a beautiful state. The mountains in the north and the west, the land around the Chesapeake Bay, Annapolis, the shores of the Potomac. It really is a blessed place once you leave the freeways. But let's move back to our topic.
Yes, good idea. Back to Margaret Brent and how she saved Maryland. Maryland, of course, was founded in 1634 as a colony where English Catholics could live their faith in freedom.
This was needed because about 100 years prior to the foundation of Maryland, King Henry VIII declared himself the supreme head of the church in England, thus founding the Anglican Church and putting English Catholics in a rather difficult position.
Yes, Catholics were required to accept Henry and his successors as the supreme head of the church. Those who didn't faced serious consequences, very often including death. About 600 English Catholics were executed during the 16th and 17th centuries, and a great many of those deaths were in horrible, gruesome fashion.
Yeah, really. Perhaps the most famous martyr from the era was Thomas More, the former Chancellor of England, now of course St. Thomas More. He had been a special confidant and advisor to King Henry, but he could not accept the split with Rome. For his refusal to acknowledge Henry as the head of the church, he was beheaded. Before submitting to the axe, he famously said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first."
Many Catholics saved their skins by going into hiding. They might outwardly seem to be good Anglicans, but they secretly remained with Rome. Many harbored priests who would travel the country incognito, offering Mass in people's homes and moving quite frequently. This went on for a long time.
Yes. Now, King Henry died in 1557. His only son to survive infancy was crowned Edward VI, and he continued his father's work. He only reigned as king for 6 years, dying at just 15 years old. The crown passed to his older half-sister, Mary. Queen Mary I was Catholic. She was the daughter of the first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and she had rejected her father's break with Rome, so there was a bit of a restoration of the Catholic Church in England.
But that restoration wasn't pleasant for many. A whole lot of Anglicans, particularly Anglican priests who were former Catholic priests, were exiled or put to death for heresy.
But Mary's reign was only for 5 years, and she died with no heirs. The crown passed to another half-sister, the appeasingly Protestant Elizabeth I. She reigned from 1558 to 1603, and she solidified the Protestant dominance of England. But then she died with no heir.
And thus ended the House of Tudor.
Probably a good thing. Henry had 3 children become monarch, and all 3 had different mothers, but none of them had heirs of their own.
So then the crown passed to a first cousin, twice removed, of the 3 previous monarchs. If you're keeping score, that means that it was...
His grandfather was their cousin, first cousin.
So, yeah.
Yes.
This was King James VI of Scotland. James was of the House of Stuart. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was forced to abdicate the Scottish throne in part because she was Catholic, and Protestants had amassed considerable power in Scotland.
But when Elizabeth I died, James VI of Scotland was the next in line to the throne, and he was happy to also become James I of England. 2 crowns are better than 1, I guess. So James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, and that means he also became the new supreme head of the Church of England. He reigned from 1603 until his death in 1625.
Now we're into the era of our drama with Maryland and the Brent family.
More or less, yes. Margaret Brent was born in 1601. The Brents were prominent in England, not nobility, but they were wealthy. The father of the family was Lord of Admington and Larkstoke, and he was sheriff, so that's something.
There were 13 children in all. The family was outwardly Anglican, but secretly Catholic. Any suspicions that they were not strictly Anglican arose when one of Margaret's sisters renounced the Anglican Church and fled to Belgium to become a Benedictine nun. Eventually, she became abbess, and 2 of her sisters joined her. But this was years down the road, and they don't play any more part in our story.
Yeah, but that did mean the prospects for the rest of the family were very much less bright. The eldest son inherited the estate, so the rest had to go find their way. As suspected Catholics, not a whole lot was open to them, so in the 1630s, after Maryland was established, Margaret, her sister Mary, and 2 of their brothers, Giles and Fulk, decided to make their names and their fortunes in the New World. They set sail and landed in Maryland in 1638.
Maryland had only been established in 1634, and I think we should give some background there too.
Sure. So we slide back to the 1620s. Our main character now is George Calvert. Calvert was a powerful politician and an advisor to King James I. Calvert was Catholic, but very secretly, because Catholics were barred from holding any position in government.
In early 1625, Calvert came out on the losing end of some political intrigue. He resigned his positions in the king's government and publicly proclaimed his Catholicism, and this was rather shocking. But King James, who was dying, did him a huge favor. Shortly before his death in March of 1625, James named Calvert the first Baron Baltimore and gave him an estate in Ireland.
Sending him to Ireland, which was still overwhelmingly Catholic, was probably a way to get him out of England, thus possibly sparing his life. Calvert immediately sought to establish a colony in the New World, both for commercial reasons and to be a safe haven for Catholics. The new king, Charles I, who was himself Protestant, but who had married a French Catholic princess, was agreeable to this, and the process was set in motion. But George Calvert died in 1632, just 5 weeks before it could be finalized.
Shortly after his death, his eldest son Cecil, the second Baron Baltimore, was granted the charter to this new colony. King Charles named it Maryland after his wife, Henrietta Maria, and Cecil Calvert was proprietor.
Yeah, I'm glad he went with Maryland because Henriettaland just doesn't, roll off the tongue the same way. Yeah.
No, it doesn't.
So Maryland was the name and Cecil Calvert was the big man.
But Cecil Calvert never went over to the New World to govern his colony.
No, Cecil Calvert knew that a Catholic colony would be the target of many malicious legal efforts in England. So he, as proprietor and Baron Baltimore, had to stay behind to defend it legally. Instead, he sent his brother, Leonard, to be the governor of Maryland. In 1634, Leonard set sail with 140 colonists and literally a boatload of supplies. They arrived and established a settlement, the first capital of Maryland, and they named it St. Mary's.
We told the story of how St. Mary's was established in our episode on the Ark and the Dove, which were the 2 ships that brought them across the ocean. It's an interesting series of events, including the first mass in the English colonies and friendly encounters with the natives. The episode is available on our website.
We also have visited a number of these historic sites on a pilgrimage, and they are included on a pilgrimage itinerary, which we can do for groups. Check out details on our site.
This is such a great trip. It was really fun to go and visit those sites, and I'd love to lead another group through the cradle of Catholicism in the English colonies. So many peaceful and just beautiful places.
They really are.
But we just need more time
Yes.
next time.
Yeah,
It was too short.
Time is not on our side. 4 years after that initial landing by Leonard Calvert and company, the ship with the Brents arrived. Margaret and her siblings arrived with letters of introduction from Cecil Calvert, who was, actually, a distant cousin of theirs. The letters granted the Brents property rights equal to those given to the original settlers who sailed over in 1634.
Upon arrival, Margaret became the first female landowner in Maryland, and within a couple of years, through family connections, business transactions, and because they brought over many additional colonists, she became one of the most significant landowners in the colonies.
She and her sister Mary managed their 70-acre plantation near St. Mary's City under the name Sisters Freehold. But this was the New World. So much land was available. Margaret and Mary controlled thousands more acres.
Margaret and Mary were also an anomaly and very historically interesting because despite the male to female ratio of 6 men to every woman and how rare it was for women to hold land in positions of authority, they never married. Some speculate that they had taken some sort of religious vows of celibacy, but there is no actual evidence to support this.
Frankly, managing such a large amount of land could just make them too busy to even think about anything else.
You might be right.
Yeah. Another element, since Margaret was such a large landowner, she took a keen interest in the laws that governed the land. Politics became an interest.
She became a political ally of Leonard Calvert, and by virtue of his marriage to her younger sister Anne, he was also her brother-in-law.
Deepening the intrigue.
Pretty much. Now, it seems like everything went pretty well for the Brents and for Maryland in the New World for a few years. But we mentioned at the beginning that Margaret had to save Maryland. So, well, then things started to go south.
Yes, and pretty swiftly. See, the problem was they were all still so English.
And England was coming to a full boil over religious issues.
And how? Maryland was established to be a Catholic haven, but there were plenty of Protestants in the New World. I mean, right across the Potomac River from Maryland was the Virginia colony. Virginia was not a Catholic haven. Virginia Protestants had opposed the establishment of a Catholic colony just across the river, but Charles I did it anyhow.
But things began to go badly for Charles in England. Parliament had always thought he was too friendly to Catholics. Then they got super upset at him for a number of other reasons having to do with taxation, foreign wars, and kind of just who was really in charge. Parliament thought Charles exercised more power than he should, and for his part, Charles thought he really possessed the power that he attempted to wield. They fought about this for about 8 years, and Parliament won. Charles was executed for treason in 1649.
While the English Civil War raged in England, a smaller version of the strife played out in the colonies. In 1645, a Protestant ship captain, Richard Ingle, attacked St. Mary's City, burned the Catholic chapel, and plundered the city. Many residents of St. Mary's, including the Brents and Governor Leonard Calvert, fled across the Potomac into Virginia.
It's funny that they fled into Virginia.
Well, they had friends over there who, while Protestant, weren't the bloodthirsty kind.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, I know, right? Leonard Calvert spent a year raising a force powerful enough to retake St. Mary's City. Margaret Brent helped in the effort, particularly with fundraising, and a year later, in 1646, they succeeded. Now, this is where things really get interesting.
Man, it was boring before. Finally.
I know, seriously. So, it was a crazy time of history. So in order to raise the money to pay the soldiers, Leonard Calvert had pledged his own estate and, importantly, that of his brother Cecil, Baron Baltimore, as security.
But after retaking the city, and before he could make good on these payments, he became ill and died. On his deathbed, he named Margaret Brent the executrix of his will, instructing her clearly, take all, pay all. Suddenly, Margaret Brent was in control of her own vast holdings, plus those of Leonard and Cecil Calvert.
Just a vast fortune with an even greater responsibility. To take care of Leonard Calvert's debts, she liquidated his estate, but she still had to figure out how to pay the soldiers who were threatening mutiny right there in the town they had helped to retake. First, she turned to the colonial legislature, hoping to get them to raise a tax to pay the soldiers. Representation in the legislature was based on land ownership, and since she held lots of land in her own right and was executrix of Leonard Calvert's will, she believed she had the right to 2 votes.
Now, at the time, no woman who was not a queen was permitted to a position in government, so her request was denied. When requesting the 2 votes, she is reported to have said, "I've come to seek a voice in this assembly, and yet, because I am a woman, forsooth, I must stand utterly by and not even have a voice in the framing of your laws." When Margaret left the chamber after being denied, she said that she protested against all proceedings unless I may be present and have a vote as aforesaid.
Yes, but she wasn't done. Her next step was more drastic. See, Leonard Calvert, in addition to being governor, was also the attorney for his brother Cecil, Lord Baltimore, in Maryland. So when Leonard named Margaret his executrix, he also gave her a claim on being attorney for Lord Baltimore in Maryland. So she went to court to press this matter, and the court agreed. Margaret Brent was named Baltimore's attorney.
As a landowner and a businesswoman, Margaret had acted for herself in court many times, so she was well prepared to act as Lord Baltimore's attorney.
Yes, and thus empowered, she immediately ordered corn to make bread for the starving soldiers, then sold enough of Lord Baltimore's cattle to pay the soldiers' wages. I mean, it seems a reasonable course of action. The alternative for Lord Baltimore was the sacking of his capital by the very army that had retaken it for him.
But Lord Baltimore was not pleased. He may not have realized the existential threat that the unpaid soldiers posed to his colony, or he may not have cared, but at any rate, he wrote a strongly worded letter against Brent to the Maryland legislature.
The legislature, the same one that had denied her a voice or a vote, defended her stewardship of his property, saying it was, quote, better for the colony's safety at that time in her hands than in any man's, for the soldiers would never have treated any others with that civility and respect. She rather deserved favor and thanks from your honor for her so much concurring to the public safety than to be justly liable to all those bitter invectives you have been pleased to express against her.
They knew that she had done well, and that no man that they knew of could have done as well, let alone better. But Lord Baltimore would not be placated. The Brents had fallen out of favor, and there was no going back.
One potential reason was the ongoing train wreck that was England in 1649. That was the year he wrote his angry letter to the legislature, and it was the year things came to a head in the English Civil War and King Charles lost his head, that is. Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector of England, more or less just a military dictator, and he was virulently, famously anti-Catholic.
If you know anything about Cromwell's history, you know that the Irish Sea was not wide enough to spare Irish Catholics from his marauding ways. So it's possible that Lord Baltimore acted against the Catholic Brents to curry favor with Cromwell.
Regardless, the rebuke from Lord Baltimore was enough for the Brents. They had been building their exit strategy from Maryland for a while. Beginning in 1647, Margaret and Mary had begun buying land in the Northern Neck area of Virginia, which is about 50 miles downriver from Washington, D.C. By 1650, they had moved to their new plantation in Virginia, which they dubbed Peace. A good name, a hoped-for new reality, I imagine.
And it worked. Oddly enough, in the very Protestant Virginia, they lived in peace. They sold their Maryland holdings bit by bit over the years and acquired more land in Virginia, establishing the first Catholic settlement in that colony.
Mary Brent died in 1658, leaving her 1,000 acres to Margaret. When Margaret died in 1671, she left her extensive holdings to various siblings and their children. Her massive estate included what is modern-day Old Town Alexandria, Mount Vernon, and Fredericksburg, Virginia.
And 15 years later, in 1686, the last Catholic king of England, James II, granted 30,000 additional acres in newly established Stafford County, Virginia, to Margaret's great-nephew George, and granted religious liberty to all who lived in that tract.
But now, nothing remains of the Brent plantation buildings, nor their family cemetery. The buildings were torched during the War of 1812, and the cemetery was vandalized during the American Civil War.
But there is an unexpected roadside marker in Virginia for those paying attention.
Yes, it was one that I saw and wondered about long before we started doing this podcast. I guess you could say it was one of the first times I really began to wonder about the breadth and depth of American Catholic history. When I was a seminarian for Arlington, I spent the summer of 2006 at St. William of York Parish in Stafford County, Virginia. St. William is just a little bit south of Quantico Marine Base. Between St. William and Quantico, as you're heading north on Route 1, there's a road that veers off to the right. At that Y intersection, there's a large 15-foot-high bronze crucifix near the road. It's hard to miss, really. I stopped one time and read the plaque. It indicates that near that spot was the location of the Brent family cemetery. Now, I never investigated further, but I always wondered what it meant, and I was really happy to finally find out when we decided to do this episode many years later.
This crucifix was erected in 1930, and in 1998, the Commonwealth of Virginia erected a marker near the crucifix to commemorate the Brents for establishing the first Catholic settlement in Virginia. So, if you're ever in southern Maryland or in Virginia along the Potomac between Alexandria and Fredericksburg, you're probably in land previously owned and managed by Margaret Brent, a Catholic woman who was perhaps the most important woman in the early colonial days of America. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic history, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Margaret Brent, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.